is my privilege as chair of the Adult Formation Committee to make the introductions this morning. But before I introduce our speaker, Dr. Andrew Dearman, I do want to say thank you to Pastor Angela. Pastor Angela, as you know, is in charge of formation, and it is because of her that we have such distinguished speakers as Dr. Andrew Dearman. So I really do want to thank her for all the work that she puts into bringing us such speakers and such presentations on Sundays like this. So let me introduce you a little bit to Dr. Dearman. First of all, I read in Angela's description that he is an honorably retired minister in the Presbyterian Church, USA. I really beg the question, what does it mean if you're dishonorably retired? Anyway, we'll ask that.
I hope not find out.
No, we'll ask that question another time. He has most recently been the senior professor of Old Testament at Fuller Theological Seminary until he retired in 2019. He also has degrees from the University of North Carolina, from Emory, and of course most notably from the finest theological seminary in the land.
Where am I kid today? Where am I kid?
I did have a 15-page copy of all of Dr. Dearman's accomplishments. If I were to read that to you, I would probably take up half of his time. But it will very quickly become apparent that he is extremely competent at speaking to us about the Old Testament. He is engaging and entertaining, and we really are very privileged to have him as our guest speaker today. I also want to welcome his wife, Kathy. We're thrilled to have you with us today, and we hope you feel welcome among us. So without further ado, Dr. Dearman, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much. Is my southern accent coming through on this kind of microphone? Okay. I saw the thumbs up. Thank you very much. We were trying, even as talented as Angela is, we couldn't quite get that close enough. It's a very sensitive mic. So I will try to hold this close to my mouth and hope it will come through. Now, first thing I want to say is how grateful I am to be here. I was here last week, as many of you will know, and had the privilege between last Sunday and this morning of spending 6 days in the great state of Michigan. And I enjoyed it, and I learned at least one new skill. I learned a lot of things, at least one new skill. Guess what that was? A Michigan left turn. We don't have those in Texas. You know, when we come up on an intersection, we want to make a left turn, we just turn left. But imagine that. Anyway, I did learn a little bit about it, and I didn't do it fast enough a couple of times, and so I heard that nice honk in the back, but I did manage to do it. I'm very grateful. Had a chance to see the Henry Ford Museum, like everything about, is it Greenwich Village or Greenwood? Greenville. I'll get it right. 3 strikes and I'm out. But we did get to the museum. I then went to, shall I put it this way, in Michigan, maybe the less great state of Ohio, for a brief trip to the museum there. I love museums. And we went to the Toledo Museum of Art. Of course, it's not as big or as nice as the Detroit Museum of Art, but it's really fun. But across the street, they have maybe you will know, the Glass Pavilion, and the wonderful, I bet it's the best in our country, display of the history of glass making, because that was a very important industry for a number of decades in Toledo. So you've got Henry Ford, and I saw all about his life yesterday. You've got Edward Libby, and what he did for glassmaking in Toledo. So I'm going home better educated and very thankful for that. Okay, I've got a PowerPoint to accompany my comments, and I'll try to be careful about turning my head, but like you, I do need to see it. And y'all remember that old show from decades ago called Howdy Doody? Remember he had a 360? So I'll just see what I can do on that regard. Last week, we started our conversation, Last week we started our conversation on this great theme that Angela assigned called belonging, and more particularly, to whom and for whom we belong. And if you were here, we talked mostly about our primary place of ministry in life, which is in families and close communities. We looked at some aspects of the Old Testament and what it had to say about that. I'm going to follow that same theme, but I'm going to concentrate now more on a kind of larger identity that gets fostered and what the Old Testament has to say in its own witness. It's not our complete Bible, but it has a number of things to say. Let me just start with a question for you. This is a suppose question. Let's say, suppose someone, maybe they're from Mars. Let's just say they're from Mars. They come down and say, this is a very interesting group of beings. Tell me, what is this year of life together in church like? I think kind of hard to answer, wouldn't it? At least briefly. Now, several ways to answer that question. One of them might be this. Well, we have a church year. And so we have a confession, then we have Lent, we've got Easter, we've got Pentecost, Christmas, and so forth. Right, friends? All these things which we could show that gives us our identity, that charts our way of common life together as Christians, at least in our corporate gathering. Well, all of you will know this to varying degrees. Our friends in the synagogue, Jews, have a very elaborate, quite detailed, if I could put it in parentheses, church year. I think I could substitute call it synagogue year, if you wanted to. And it helps remind them, and by implication, it will remind us of who we are, to whom we belong, and for whom we belong. So what I'm going to do in the next several minutes is hit some of the high parts of the synagogue year, or the Jewish church year, if you want to call it that, that'd be fine. And then to concentrate on two places where it comes together in one physical place: Jerusalem and the temple. So put on your seatbelts if you like. I know that you're good Presbyterians, which means you can multitask, you can chew and listen at the same time. I understand how all that goes. And we'll get going, and I'll watch my clock and try to save a little time for questions, comments, corrections, etc. Okay, friends? Okay. Last week we looked at this key text. It's Genesis 12, 1 through 3. I'll show it again and say to you that it's a kind of a précis, a little small indication. It's a very programmatic text of the mission-wide reach of the Old Testament and into the New Testament itself. So if we were in a class at a university, people who study narrative talk about large narratives. They use this great term. It says I'm a visitor and a speaker. I have to use it, a meta-narrative. It's one of those terms for a large story that has big encompassing elements to it. And when I was a kid growing up in North Carolina, we used to talk about the greatest story ever told. It's the same thing. And the Old Testament, which is a large narrative, has instructions and poems and prophecies and so forth in it as well, is in reality an unfolding drama of redemption. Starts with Genesis, ends with Revelation 22 as a whole Bible, and it is the greatest story ever told. And it's a very programmatic element here, very early on in the Old Testament itself. So we saw this last week. It's the call to Abram, as he's called here, later Abraham and Sarah. And they're to move from his father's house. Remember our conversation about house and household last week, if you were here? The descendants of Abraham and Sarah, who don't yet have children, will become a great nation. You want to set aside the foot, I'm going to just call it people of God. This wonderful word, blessing. I'll bless you and make your name great so that you will be a blessing. Remember we talked about that term blessing last week a little bit. Its broad meaning is this, that God intends for things in their proper context to flourish. And blessing is to intend that, whether it's the family, the nation, or the earth itself. And it's this last element in it. It's the programmatic statement that runs all the way through the Bible, that in the descendants of Abraham and Sarah shall all the families of the earth be blessed. Reach a goal intended by a great and wise Creator. I won't read to you again the parenthesis, but it's often considered the ancestral promise. It's the great covenant promise that extends like a awning over the biblical text. It even is taken over into the New Testament, as you'll see in that quotation. Now, I don't know about this part of the church, but when I was growing up, people would talk about the frozen chosen Presbyterians. Y'all ever heard that? Okay. You hear so much, you don't laugh anymore. It doesn't have a term that people have used. The better term to use than predestination, in my judgment, the broader term to use, is the term election. The Old Testament and the New Testament has a lot to say about election. And here's the definition. Even I grasp it. God chooses some on behalf of others. Very straightforward, isn't it? God chooses some on behalf of others. It's a historical unfolding of our faith. So it's ingrained in the Israelite culture. We saw the perfect example just a moment ago. God chose Abraham and Sarah. Not because they're better than anybody else, because they have a job to do. On behalf of others. Please nod your head. I feel a sermon coming on. Last week we looked at being called as a member of a family and so forth. But think of it this way. God chose Jerusalem as a place, it's kind of an accommodated way to reveal divine things to us, and a temple. God chose David. You got it, friends? It's almost like the rhythm. God chose David on behalf of others. Right? God chose Jerusalem on behalf of others. God built a temple for self-revelation on behalf of others. Jesus chose 12 disciples. Is he going to keep them to himself? On behalf of others. That's a tried and true biblical principle. It works for mundane people like me. God chose me on behalf of others. So I belong to God, and my ministry carried out is on behalf of others and to others. So this last week, second bullet point, this week, I'm going to look at the church year in the Old Testament. Let's put it that way. And in particular, 2 points of focus: Jerusalem and the temple. Okay, here's the calendar, friends. Are you able to see that? Or is this in your way? You see this okay? It's okay. Okay, thank you. The months, as we know them, are there in blue in the center. We start with what looks easily recognizable. And you go out, and in, would you call this gold? In the gold are the names in Hebrew, but in English lettering. And one of the first complicating things, all calendars are complicated. Chronology, complicated stuff. But each month in the Old Testament, which has this different name, does not quite correspond to ours. So they don't have a March quite like ours. They've got a month, which will have part of March and part of April in it. And it works that way all the way around. It's a lunar calendar. But in the spring, they have a calendar which is both agricultural and historical/theological. So in the spring, early on, they have what's called Passover. You will all recognize that term. And along with it is unleavened bread. And sometimes the term Passover simply suffices for those two things. And then there's another one day that goes along with it, which is called first fruits, where you get the first things that come out in March. Remember, it's the Northern Hemisphere. And you hold those up before God and say, thank you so far for the first fruits. We're going to trust you for what comes next. So they'll have a celebration for that. Then move on a couple of months, and you come to, here you get the Greek term Pentecost, sometimes called the Festival of Weeks in Hebrew. Pentecost is the Greek term. More about that in a moment. So late spring here, and it has to do with the harvest of grains. Then you kind of move over the summertime, and you come to the fall. So that's on the left-hand side as you're looking at it. And they have a festival called Tabernacles, sometimes called Booths. And then they have a Day of Atonement. Many of you will know that term, Yom Kippur. You've heard that term. It means Day of Covering or Day of Atonement. And then trumpets there is the Old Testament term for what you will know as Rosh Hashanah, or the Jewish New Year. And these are the building blocks of a very rich celebration that goes out through the year to explain to people to whom they belong and for whom they belong, a sense of identity and calling. Okay, now, should you decide, I really want to read up a little bit more on this. The one place in the Old Testament where instructions are kind of spread out, the place to get a quick introduction to what are called the appointed festivals in the book of Leviticus. That's a tough read for Christians. But in chapter 23, those 44 verses, you'll find a little précis of each of the festivals all run together. Now, the first one is the Sabbath, and that comes once a week. Let me just put it to you this way in terms of establishing an identity. In the ancient world, there are all kinds of celebrations and festivals. No other people had a 1 in 7 pattern, except for our spiritual ancestors, the Hebrews. So that was one of the first markers of identity, that they took off 1 in 7. Now, for many of us, myself included, I remember growing up in Sunday school, I first learned about the Jewish Sabbath when Jesus was criticizing the legalism of it. Remember that one? But the fact of the matter is, it's a nourishing, life-giving institution when done properly. You can also put it not in a legalistic fashion, but the way Jews typically do put it, and that's what I would call a liberationist or a grace-filled way. It's a way of saying to the world, y'all work a lot. We work 6 days in many ways, but on the 7th day we rest, and we are sure that God will take care of it. We don't need to work on it. It's our day of rest and thanksgiving and worship, and 6 days will be enough. And we'll show the world by that, by our consistent application of this principle. Now, as I'll show you in a moment, the central sanctuary becomes the focal point of these practices, even though, as you all know, our Jewish friends have great practices they do among their families. So here's the list again that you saw on the calendar. So I won't go them again, just to tell you where they are. Now, should you decide, this is at least somewhat interesting, I'd like to see this present. Angela has the PowerPoint. You can have it. Free of charge, right, Angela? They can have it free of charge. So if you want to go and say, where did that Southern speaking guy put it? Is it Leviticus? Okay, yes, right here it is. Let's start again with the Sabbath very briefly. It was to be a sign of an everlasting covenant. Every Sabbath was a sign to everyone else around. We rest because God has provided for our needs on this day, and we celebrate Sabbath in and Sabbath out. Because they did it continually, no limitation. It was to be a sign of the eternal covenant that God had made with them. circumcision being similar, a mark in the flesh to show the sign of an eternal covenant God has made with the chosen people. The central sanctuary, Pentateuch, first 5 books, assumes a central sanctuary. That's the perspective in which all these instructions come. Knowing well that families do things together in their families and clans and so forth. The book of Deuteronomy, chapter 12, has this great phrase that the people of God shall go up periodically to quote the place that the Lord your God shall choose out of all your tribes. So a bit indistinct. It doesn't use the name Jerusalem there. It's just the place the Lord your God will choose. You see the method in my madness talking about election and choice a few minutes ago? You choose one place on behalf of everybody. I might just put it to you this way. It's not a perfect analogy, but maybe it's helpful in our culture. You remember with the colonies back a couple of centuries ago, so what are we going to do for government? They end up choosing one place that was not in a particular colony, but it would be the central place for some administration, right? D.C. You could say, is it Virginia? Well, sort of, but no. It's the District of Columbia. Is it in Maryland? Well, sort of. No, it's actually District of Columbia. It's its own special place on behalf of others. It'd be the place of David's kingship. Remember, David was chosen by God on behalf of others. The location of the temple, first built by Solomon, and so forth. So let's quickly look at these festivals, a little thumbnail sketch each time. So Passover and unleavened bread, early spring, they can go together. Passover is one day where they sacrifice the lamb. It's the birthday of the people of God, their redemption from Israel, the sign that they belong exclusively to God, and their mission is among the people of the world. I like this one. Today, if you were to go to a synagogue, they will read the great text in the book of Exodus about the event of Exodus, in the book of Exodus, and then they're going to read the little book called the Song of Songs. And they read that, let's call it in a typological, spiritual way, because there is the celebration of the love of Solomon for a bride, and they take that to be God's love for Israel as a people. So if you ever ask that question from the New Testament side, where did this idea of the church as the bride of Christ come from? You know what the answer is, of course? The Old Testament, the first part of the Bible. That's where it came from. Passover, one-day celebration, and then they got 7 days of the unleavened bread. The Festival of Weeks in the late spring. And by the way, what a privilege it was to ride around the southern half of Michigan and see all of the fields. Marvelous. Cut wheat, corn, vegetables. Man, I loved it. I haven't seen anything that green since the last time I was in Michigan. You know, where I live, a lot more brown. So, it's an agricultural festival with a historical component to it. So, there's great thanks for the harvest of grains. Barley comes, early May. Wheat comes late May, early June. Fascinating to see that if you don't have mechanized means of reaping. It's the second of the 3 main festivals, remember? Passover. And now this one. Today, Jews read the book of Ruth in its entirety in their synagogue during the Festival of Weeks. Now, here's a great theology. They celebrate at this time not just the agriculture, but the giving of the law, instruction for the people of God at Mount Sinai. So you see how identity is being formed? The first one, as you come along, redemption, your birthday, you belong to God. Second one, God's got a covenant and instructions for your life. And they read the book of Ruth because Ruth was a Gentile who came into the people of God. Or as Boaz will say, if you read that great little book, one of my favorites in the Old Testament. So Boaz says to Ruth, bless you because you have come to dwell under the wings God of Israel. Isn't that a great metaphor under the wings of the God of Israel? Great mother eagle. You come to dwell under the wings of the God of Israel. They also remind themselves that in a historical moment, God chose them, that I'm going to just grind that little phrase for the rest of the morning. Chose some on behalf of others. God spoke Hebrew at Mount Sinai, but God's intention is to incorporate all the families of the earth. Remember Genesis 12:3? Please nod your head. That's the intention. So they read, seriously, all jokes aside, they read the book of Ruth to remind themselves that they are still at the midpoint in God's unfolding drama. There'll be a time when all the families of the earth come along, and Ruth is sort of the down payment of example, even in the Old Testament, of that greater goal. So how does it get its name Pentecost? So on the sacrifice of the Passover, they count from the next day 49 days. That's why it's called the Festival of Weeks, 7 sevens. And so that 50th day is when they start the Festival of Weeks, or First Fruits is sometimes called. The Greek term for 50 is Pentecost. So Greek-speaking Jews simply called the festival Pentecost. Now, think how closely aligned the Old Testament is with its outgrowth in the New. We have Easter at Passover time. Christ is our Passover, as the great apostle said, sacrificed for us. They have a Pentecost. We have a Pentecost. Now, friends, think about this with me for a moment. Do you remember how Luke describes, I know you do, the first day of Pentecost for us? Acts chapter 2. Luke, the great physician who's writing this, starts with a description of people from all over the world who've come on pilgrimage, you see, up to the central sanctuary. And he goes all through the world, names different kinds of people who were there. And then he says, a miracle took place because all peoples from different places were hearing the good news about God and Jesus in their own language. See, that little book of Ruth sets that up. And Pentecost is a way to say, in a provisional way, the gospel-oriented New Covenant community of the church has this understanding that all the families of the earth are incorporated, Jew and Gentile alike, and a common denominator in the possession of the Spirit, which indwells everyone. So Greek-speaking Jews call the festival day Pentecost. Trumpets, it's simply the first day of the year as they begin to redo their calendar order. The reason I want to do this for you is, you see, our Jewish friends here in our country, when they celebrate Passover, we're close to Easter. We're the dominant part of this section of Western culture. Right, friends? So, they're like Rodney Dangerfield, we don't get any respect. When they get ready to celebrate Pentecost, what are we doing? We're celebrating our Pentecost at about the same time. So when it comes fall, we don't have anything quite like that. They love it. Because they're not under the influence of the dominant culture. What I mean by that. They're not hostile at all to us, or we to them, simply that they get overshadowed. Here, the segment in the fall is called the High Holy Days. Perhaps you've heard that term. So I just thought you'd like to know how it rolled around this year. September 8th was their New Year celebration. And one of the things about the fall is they continue this theme of God's work through them in history, which the church inherits, of course. And so it hasn't rained in a while. In a Mediterranean climate, so there it may have been 6 months or so since it rained when it comes to the fall. So they'll talk about the power and the wonder of water. They call it living water. Remember Jesus in the Gospel of John talking about living water that will come out of disciples? Or the prophet Jeremiah saying God is a fountain of living water. These things get celebrated here in the fall. So when they think about New Year, they also think about the year to come and then the wider opening that God will make for the future. So they have a kind of future orientation of some of these things, which I'll hit as we go along. So that's September the 8th. The Day of Atonement, you will know, the single most solemn occasion in the Jewish church calendar. has to do with forgiveness and what it takes for God to cover the sins of people and to renew them. They do this once a year. Leviticus 16 has a lot of detail on this one. I won't rehearse it for you. You can find it there, where Aaron changes his clothes, they sacrifice the lamb and so forth. Christian overtones for this are apparent from the New Testament. So it began on the evening of September the 15th. It was a one day. And now this is the third of the great festivals, called Booths and Tabernacles. It's a week long. The term booths or tabernacles, you may know it. Some of our Jewish friends sometimes put tents in their backyard. Have y'all ever seen that? So that the kids can camp out. All the festivals have things for children to do. It's a great education, fun, always special food, always special readings, always special activities. Great way to maintain an identity, especially if you're in a hostile environment. Great way to remind yourself who you are and who you're called to be. It celebrates the harvest of late fruits. It has an alternative name of ingatherings, because you can imagine, remember they're in the northern hemisphere, this is where the late ripening things like grapes and olives, particularly olives. The olive harvest will be beginning about right now on the eastern part of the Mediterranean. So they also remind themselves that after the great event of the Exodus, after the great event of covenant making and instruction at Mount Sinai, there was a 40-year hiatus where they marched in the wilderness. Remember that part of the story? It takes a while to get to the promised land. And there are things that we will do to throw up self-roadblocks. Just nod your head, it happens. The human condition. And so they celebrate the fact that God would get them through a dry time. It lasts a whole generation. It's sort of a typology for human life and the way it goes. And they read the little book of Ecclesiastes just one time a year in the synagogue. You remember how it begins? Vanity of vanity, all is vanity. There are a lot of things that we do that result in vanity, or as the other translation says sometimes, chasing after the wind. And I read that book to know that even in the driest season, if you're living on the run, God nevertheless is still with them and thus us. All right, so you got it. 3 great festivals: redemption, covenant and law giving, and sustenance throughout the wandering of your life. Now, that's a pretty good way to define who you are. This particular festival is celebrated September 20 to 27, so our Jewish friends, as we speak, are undergoing this celebration. And if 7 days is not enough, at the end they'll have a little minor celebration they've developed. It's post-biblical, called the Joy of Torah. So they'll march around with their Torah scrolls and have yet one more day of a party. These are called collectively the High Holy Days. So these festivals that are set out in the Pentateuch were the first 5 books. Judaism in its practice is so rich, there are other additional things, some of them which you will know. I'll do just a couple of comments on them. Literally, just a couple of comments. So, here we go. There's one associated with the book of Esther. Many of you will know this, because you're good Presbyterians. It's called Purim, or Purim, the way it would be pronounced in Hebrew. It remembers the deliverance of the Jews from the hands of that wicked Persian administrator named Haman during the Persian Empire. So they have that celebration. This is, by the way, and I'm actually sorry to report this part. Our Halloween, which is just taking on, shall I say it? You can run me out of town if you want to. Shall I say it? Kind of grotesque elements, people going crazy. Am I the only one that thinks that? You can hit me if you want to. It's okay. Anyway, our secular Jewish friends in Israel have started wearing costumes for Purim, having all kind of American parties and things like that. It is what it is. You had a sermon today from a portion of the book of Lamentations. There's one day during the year where our Jewish friends, it's a solemn day, they gather in the synagogue and they read all 5 chapters of the Lamentations over the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, the first temple. That's a lot of lamentations at one time. But they do that to remind themselves of the tragedies that can strike during a time. Hanukkah is one you'll know. It's nod your head, you can recognize that. When it comes in December, it has to do with the deliverance of the time. It's not a biblical festival as such, but it is something important in their history. It used to be a quite minor festival in Judaism, but because Christmas is so strong in our culture, they've made Hanukkah stronger. Just kind of a way to maintain their own identity. And then this other one, rejoicing over the Torah, it comes at the end of the Festival of Booths. So just a little taste of something that's very rich. Here it again is that same picture. You see, if you go through the year, think of what it says about your mission in life and who you are. Can I put it this way, friends? Would that our Christian education in our life together could be as strong as this for us. It can be, but that we would take it that seriously. That as we go throughout the year for the main elements of our faith. Pilgrimage. God chose Jerusalem and said people can go up there periodically to celebrate these festivals and so forth. It's a chosen city. Now here's a quotation from our Jewish friends. It's a quotation that's about 1,500 years old, which means in Judaism that's recent. But it has a way of talking about Jerusalem symbolically as the navel or the center of the earth. Where the temple is the center of the center. Way of saying that where God is specially present, the rest of the world should revolve around it. Okay, just one map. Remember, map does more than tell you about territory, right? It's always an interpretation of what it tries to represent. This is a German map from 1581. I love it. It's a clover leaf. If you can't read it, will you trust me? Right there in the center it says Jerusalem. It takes seriously an understanding of the centrality of God's self-revelation. You can see this, I'm sure, Africa, Asia, Europe. Now, down at the bottom it says, Die Neue Welt, the New World, America. I don't know if this is Columbus or not. A little sailing vessel right there. Jerusalem, the center, chosen on behalf of everybody else. But I want to say before I forget as we go on in the next segment here, is that the Old Testament puts a lot of emphasis on the actual city of Jerusalem, as well as on its symbolic value. My suggestion is, as Christians, it's the symbolic and theological value. It's not actually the stones of the current Jerusalem, important as that may be. We want a fair and just use of that place. But it's really what it represents about a place where God's people gather and learn who they are and how it projects an understanding of the future. I think it's most important. Okay. A couple of quotes for you. You always have to have a good quote. In Psalm 78, remember the language about election. God chose the tribe of Judah, not because God despised the other 11, but because there was one that would have a place of privilege. Or as the larger Bible would put it, with privilege comes responsibility. Mount Zion is the location of the temple there in Jerusalem, the high point. God built a sanctuary. Of course, Solomon actually built it, but God had it built. He chose David on behalf of others. I know you're going to run me out of town for saying that too many times. I'm sorry. Psalm 46, there's a river whose streams make glad the city of God. Remember the life-giving power of water. So you've got a little spring that runs out right here, and it makes glad the city of God, the holy habitation of the Most High. God's self-revelation, chosen place. A couple of quick illustrations for you, friends. I'll just do this quickly. So take the terrain the geography of the place, what we know from historical sources, and in a limited way what we know from archaeology, actual digging in the area. So the city of Jerusalem in Old Testament times looks something like this. A few houses. Remember last week on how the houses are together behind the wall? Then you'll have a palace here, a palace there, and a temple at the top. And the water coming out, you can see from the stream coming out down here from that little spring called the Spring of Gihon. Trust me on this, and some of you will know it. The main water source of the old city of Jerusalem to this very day is the same water source that David and Solomon drank from. When it does finally rain and snow in the hill country there in the central part of Israel, it goes down through the limestone and it pops up in each spring, like right here. Here's an even better way of looking at it. You've got this spur of land that comes down, and small little valleys on this side. This one is filled in over time, and the high point of the temple right here. So, here is an aerial photo. I hope this is not blocking anybody's sight. So, this would be part of the old city of Jerusalem today. And you'll see a platform right here. The gold dome right there, which is a Muslim shrine. And then right here is the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And so you can see right here, give you an idea of scale, that's just over 30 acres of a platform. All of you will recognize the term the Western Wall or the Wailing Wall. This is it right here. And those are the stones in that platform right here that were laid by Herod the Great's engineers when he expanded the temple. That beautiful temple that was there when Jesus and the disciples were in their public ministry. And so the oldest part of the city goes down in this area right here. So if you go there today, and some of you have done that, Herod's engineers laid many of these blocks right here to make a platform of 30 acres. The temple in the New Testament times would have set right about where it was in the Old Testament, right here, open to the east. This whole area right here would have had a portico in it where Jesus, the disciples, and others would have gathered there when they were in Jerusalem. I thought you'd like to see this one, Temple Mount at sunset. Isn't that a great picture? So you can get a little idea again of scale. So here is that little valley down here. This would have been the extension of the city. If you look right there, you've got Mount Scopus area. Those are the hills of Judah right there, and the Golden Dome. Quick little story on that one, friends. So when the Islamic takeover of the area came along, the platform was there. The Jewish temple had been torn down in the year 70 AD by the Romans, and there's just some ruins there. This was, of course, several centuries later. So they put the shrines there. So they have been there for quite some time. The dome of the rock that has the gold there is beautiful tile work and so forth. And it had up until the mid-60s, if I just say so, a kind of dull, ugly, bronze dome. So they decided, this is when Jordan controlled the area before the 67 war, that they would do a new roof on it. They wanted to put gold on it. So King Hussein, who was the king of Jordan at the time, said, well, how much will that cost? And somebody said, well, just a little bit of gold around it would cost $11.2 million. And the king said, well, that's a good idea. Just send me the bill. I'll take care of it. Wouldn't you like to be able to write a check for something that's important to you?
What was the figure?
11.2. That's when gold costs less than it does now.
Well, the Turks had, when they have harems of Eastern European women and they have soldiers of Eastern European eunuchs, it's easy to write after 200 years or so conquest a check for something like that compared to the American taxpayer who can't even fund their healthy food for their grandkids.
Yeah. That was that story was one where it was a very contested space. They had to make the decision quickly. The king said, I'll do it. Now, here's Solomon's temple. a diagram just so you get a chance to see what the place may have looked like. Nothing exists like this now. It's all torn down, but we have very detailed instructions for the book of Kings, for example, and a number of similar structures from the ancient world. So if you look down at the bottom, that's the best place to start. So on the left-hand side is the main middle room. It had the beams of what were called the cedars of Lebanon. It was the main room. It was, remember, there were 3 rooms to it. So if you start now over to the right, up here you'll see the footprint. Porch, middle room, Holy of Holies. Porch, middle room, Holy of Holies. Here's the thing for us to grasp, friends. The temple was understood as a kind of symbolic representation of divine presence. God is the cosmic king, and it would have some form of a palace. This is an accommodation to us in our historical way of thinking. Very important and powerful nevertheless. So it's not that large. The courtyard is where all the worshipers gathered. The only people who went into the temple would be the priest, representing the congregation behind them. They would make an offering or a prayer, they would come back out and represent God to the people. So worship takes place outside. What your New Testament does, in great use of symbolism, is to say that Jerusalem is like a spiritual home. And the way to think about it is that the church is a spiritual home. And the church is also a gathered community. The church is a spiritual temple. So you'll see in the book of Ephesians, for example, it describes the early church as if it were a human temple, kind of knit together. And Paul will talk about Jerusalem, which above, which is our home. These are very powerful ways of representing an identity. Okay, a couple of comments there in your bullet points just so that you will see something of the description. The Holy of Holies in the back, which is thought of as a kind of symbolic throne room for the invisibly enthroned God. Here are some of the dimensions for you right there. A cubit is about 18 inches approximately. So it's not that large. Here, temple and courtyard. I have another way of showing the courtyard in a moment. Here is a great basin for washing and cleansing. Think about our baptismal font as an analogy to that. Here's the great altar, so large that you had to walk up on it for making offerings. Here's the cutaway. So the Holy of Holies is back here with the Ark of the Covenant and the cherub figures, which the ark is thought of as the footstool, and the curved wings of the cherub are thought of as it were as a kind of throne support. Remember what Boaz said to Ruth, friends? You're blessed to come to live under the wings of the God of Israel. Okay, here is a depiction from the front entrance. So they would open the door and you could see in as the priest would go in. The great theology of priesthood. I'm going to do it in about 30 seconds to a minute. Everybody ready? Put on your seatbelts. So people would gather in the courtyard. They had worship every day. And then on the festivals they had special things. On the Sabbath they had special things. They had daily prayer. And the priest would go inside as the people were outside praying, representing them before God, invisibly enthroned in the Holy of Holies. And then the priest would come back and offer blessing and instruction from God. The priest was the classical go-between. Now, I hope you know where I'm going. The great book called The Letter to the Hebrews. Jesus is our great high priest who takes us into the very presence of God, makes a way for us, and comes back in the cross and resurrection to claim us and bring us forward. All that based on this idea of the temple as the representative of God in our midst. A place where people go up to meet God and one another. Here's a cutaway to the interior. Lots of things could be said about the symbolism, but I'm going to restrain myself. If you have questions towards the end, I'll be glad to entertain them. So here's a great phrase from 2 Samuel, where they brought up from there, the ark of God is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. Of course, that's a symbolic representation, because, as you'll see from our next slide, Holy of Holies, middle room, porch. Your menorah there, the light of the world. The incense there, it represents the prayers of the people outside wafting their way into God's presence. Of course, God is not limited to a building. The Old Testament knows that. But the building is understood as a great representation of divine presence. Even the highest heavens cannot contain God, and that's tricky. They cannot. Okay, my last little segment here, friends. And this is particularly important for our Jewish friends in these fall celebrations. The prophets on Jerusalem and David's greater son. David's greater son, of course, is the Messiah, but Jerusalem plays a central role itself. David's greater son would return there. Just remember, Jesus and the disciples had gone on pilgrimage at Passover. That's why they were in Jerusalem on that climactic last week. Where else would they be? Having said that, the Revelation of John, the last book in the New Testament, depicts an expanded and renewed Jerusalem as the eternal home of the faithful. That's what's most important in our faith. And the way John presents it is, in a vision, he sees a heavenly structure, a city coming down out of heaven and filling a renewed and transformed heavens and an earth. You see, that's the power of Jerusalem. When God brings it forth in its fullness. I mentioned to you the celebration of water, which takes place now. Remember, for the original Hebrews in that part of the world, it has not rained since about March or April, approximately. They have dew, very heavy dew, so they're able to bring the crops along, but they're waiting for what are called the winter and early spring rains. And so they will have celebrations, they will pour out water, they will thank God for what they believe is coming. So here's my line about the Old Testament and one of its powerful, instructive elements to us. Particularly the prophets believe that everything that God made is capable of transformation. Not just people, but land and animals, everything that God made is capable of transformation. And in the eschaton, at the end, that gets fully revealed. Our marching orders, our mission, is to represent that and to work with God as it comes about in our generation and over time. So this element about water. Water flows from the temple, says Ezekiel, looking forward. It's not true yet, but he can see it. He can taste it. He knows it's coming. It'll flow from the temple towards the east and vivify the Dead Sea. You may know the Dead Sea, about the saltiest body of water around. And you know why it's called the Dead Sea, friends? Nothing can live in it now. Remember the line? Everything God made is capable of transformation. So the prophet can see a time when the sweet, fresh, living water will vivify even the Dead Sea. Now that's something, as they say in North Carolina, you can sink your teeth into. You can grasp that. Another way of talking about that from a different prophet. These are just illustrations of how the Old Testament opens up a horizon the New Testament inherits and richly clings to and develops. Micah. You see how it's put in terms of geography to be understood by the original audience. Days to come, a mountain of the Lord's house. That's Mount Zion. That's Jerusalem. But if you look forward, when God touches your spiritual eye, you can see it. Peoples will come, but they want to be instructed. Come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, the house of the God of Jacob. He may teach us his way and walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth instruction, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. You will know this, of course, from that great quotation, they'll beat their swords into plowshares, their spears into pruning hooks, and no more war. I want to set my vision that way. I want to live like I believe that's coming. People probably won't get here before I die, but it's coming. Or a good Old Testament way of talking about security and life together. It's this worldly, but think about it. Everybody can sit under their own vine and their own fig trees, and no one will make them afraid. Or Isaiah 11. The sheep shall come from the stump of Jesse. Jesse, of course, was David's father. This is the hope for the Messiah that comes from David's line, which we believe correctly is Jesus. Wonderful description. I won't read it to you, but you will know the great image that comes about 2/3 of the way through. The wolf will lie with the lamb, the leopard with the kid, the calf, the lion together. A little child shall lead them. In verse 9, they will not hurt or destroy on all my holy mountain. But the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. You see the territorial element? It starts with the mountain of the Lord and it goes all the way out. I love that picture of the animals, the prey, and the predator. What was the line? Everything God made is capable of transformation, can be and will be transformed. One more to look at before our time is up. Another way that the prophets open up the future, celebrated this time by our Jewish friends. We should celebrate it the same. See how it starts? On this mountain. Not just any mountain. This mountain, that would be Jerusalem. But it goes from there. The Lord will make for everyone a feast of rich food, a feast of well-matured wines. And there's a crop walk today, right? It's kind of a down payment of what we all hope comes in the future. Now there's a shroud, it seems, over the people's where we have death and problems. God will swallow up death forever. That's coming. It's already demonstrated in the cross and resurrection. We're included. With all peoples. Take away disgrace. It will be said on that day, this is our God, we waited. He might save us. This is the Lord for whom we have waited. Let us be glad and rejoice in his salvation. So our Jewish friends right now, as they're waiting on the water to come, and they open up, they just had their new year, they look towards, this is their time to think about the future. Why not for us as well? A chance to think about what God has out in front and our mission and support in our generation along the way. Did I hear Pastor May say that next week is Communion Sunday? Is that right? It's coming soon. That sister's nodding her head, so it's got to be true. Yeah, first Sunday. I love that picture on the left. Little communion set on the right. So next Sunday, good friends in Christ, when you come to worship, be reminded that you'll get a little bread and wine. But it's a harbinger, not just a reminder of your salvation, but of the great gathering to come, as in that previous quote. But Jesus, you see, is our Passover. So you celebrate the Lamb of God. He's the great giver of instructions. We don't have a Mount Sinai that way. We have a Sermon on the Mount. We have instructions from the apostles. And you'll have a great reminder. You'll do it in remembrance of Jesus. Just cast your eye forward. Remind yourself how many generations in the past have done this. As far as we know, we are members of the greatest family in the universe. And then cast your eye forward. me remind you yet one more time, to whom you belong and for whom you belong. So friends, that's my time with you. Thank you very much. I will say to you, no applause necessary. Got a moment? Comments? Questions? Corrections? Yes, sir, please.
I hope you've enjoyed Michigan. As Romney says, it's the place where the trees are just the right height. I think given all these oak trees, that's probably why it's such a great shady place, nice soil. I just had a question about your opinion on if, in these politically correct times, I pay a lot of attention to language, just because I don't like to say something that'll trigger someone into finding offense. So I don't like to use the three-letter word, AEW, but you mentioned that word being, quote, friends who haven't meant us any harm or anything, but do you think that thesis holds in the context of communist rebellion in the Soviet Union that resulted in murdering the Tsar's family and potential communist subversion over the last, let's just say, to be conservative, 130 years?
I guess if I have to answer, I'd say yes. I think it does hold. There have been Jews who have done bad things. There have been Christians who've done bad things. There have been Muslims who've done bad things. But I do regard Israel and Jews fundamentally as friends. I'm a big person, you asked. So yes, I do.
And to clarify any potential direct or gossiping accusations of anti-Semitism against myself, our family has been very tolerant and loving and always welcoming the Jews into our house. My grandmother, a peer graduate of Maine, having served as a Presbyterian minister for 13 years after graduating from Princeton Seminary. And actually her family people were on the Mayflower and served as the surgeon, Fuller, General Fuller. But anyway, so, my nanny has, her eldest son got divorced, remarried in 1997, married a Jewish woman, and Matt is a teacher. She had 2 children, Matt and Jenny. Matt celebrated the bar mitzvah in Israel against the Wailing Wall, so it was interesting to see that picture. And we've always welcomed them into the family as stepchildren or grandchildren, as my cousins, Jenny and Matt, as I knew them. So I'm not an extremist or anything in belief. I'm just trying to clarify narratives.
Yeah. Quick comment, if I may, on that one. The way St. Paul puts it to us in the letter to the Romans is that Christians are actually grafted into the tree that was started, see, in the Old Testament. So we inherit the promises that God made to Israel. Jim Sanders, a name you may know Jim Sanders, was a great Old Testament scholar. He always described Israel as God's first love, but not God's only love. Thank you, friends, for our time to be together.
Thank you for being here. I just wanted to invite you to our next Sunday's Kyes. We'll have Dr. Ted Hebert with us, who's another Old Testament scholar. He'll be talking about the culture and the land, and so that's going to be really fascinating. Dr. Hebert was my Old Testament professor, and I was at McCormick, and he was truly one of my favorites. And so I really invite you to come to that session next week. And thank you so much, Dr. Dearman. And before you go, can you bless us with a prayer?
Privilege. Lord, for the privilege of gathering this day, our Christian Sabbath, to sing your praises, to be instructed and encouraged. And we now be sent out to serve in what we say and what we do. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Dr. Dearman, safe travels. When's your flight?
Soon.
We'll be thinking of you.
Yeah, thank you. 4 o'clock.
Thank you.